It is a great honor to be joined by Professor Melvyn Leffler. He is the professor of history at the University of Virginia, and he recently authored a book titled Confronting Saddam Hussein, George W. Bush and the Invasion of Iraq. How are you today, Melvyn? Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So, we're recording this on the 6th of September, so pretty close to the 22nd anniversary of the September 11 attacks. So, since it is somewhat related to the book at hand, tell me about your memories during the tragic day.
Well, on September 11th, 2001, I actually was in Washington, D.C. It was the beginning of a new academic year. I was on research leave. I had a fellowship at the Woodrow Wilson International Center. I was going to be a guest scholar there for that year. And if I'm pretty sure, as I recall, it was my very first day. I'd been, of course, to the Wilson Center many years before, but in that September of 2001, it was going to be my first day at the Wilson Center. And I was walking from my apartment early in the morning. I walked right past the White House and then turned down 14th Street to head to the Ronald Reagan building where the Woodrow Wilson Center was located. And when I finally got to the Wilson Center around 9 a.m., I went in and I saw a few people watching television, and that mystified me because although there were TV sets in various hallways and lounges, I had never seen people watching TV. And I walked in and I saw people watching a jet fly into one of the World Trade Centers, and people were just mystified by it and were sitting there. And I remember watching it again and again. And then I walked out, and about 20 minutes later, I returned just about the time a second jet flew into the World Trade Center. And I remember the havoc and chaos and uncertainty that all of that engendered. I remember the Wilson Center and the Ronald Reagan building being people being asked to immediately leave and go home. There was an expectation or a fear that the Ronald Reagan building might be the subject of an attack itself. People tended to leave immediately. I actually hung around a little bit, and then at around 11:30 or noon, I left, and I walked about 3/4 of a mile to my apartment north of the White House. And I remember just how quiet and how somber everything was at that time. No traffic, no cars, police out on the streets. It was immediately a transformed city. Those are my thoughts of that day, September 11th, 2001.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So within that same year, President George W. Bush, who we're going to discuss in greater detail, launched an invasion into Afghanistan. And it is no coincidence that in 2021, President Joe Biden, wishes to withdraw from Afghanistan. And his withdrawal was, I think, universally seen as bad and catastrophic. But he did it in the year which marked the 20th anniversary of both 9/11 and the invasion of Afghanistan. So I think in many ways, America and the world at large is still feeling the after effects of this particular attack. Do you suppose that there are many other ways in which we're still feeling that aftershock?
Absolutely. The consequences have been dramatic, both inside the United States, inside Iraq, inside the entirety of the Middle East, and really amongst America's allies. The aftermath and ramifications of 9/11 affected America's relations with China and with Russia. So yes, the consequences have been enormous. I mean, for the United States, of course, it led to eventually led not only to the military intervention in Afghanistan, but it led to the invasion of Iraq. It led to the deaths of 8,000 or 9,000 American troops, and of course to the injuries of tens of thousands additional soldiers, men and women. It contributed enormously to the growing partisan strife inside the United States. It really contributed a lot to not only the partisan rifts, but the widespread disillusionment as the United States efforts in Iraq, as well as in Afghanistan, proved to be ineffective. The disillusionment with the US government inside the United States mounted. So the loss of faith and trust in government is not solely responsible to the aftermath of 9/11, but the failed interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq, the costly interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq have tremendously affected political and social and actually economic life inside the United States. Of course, inside Iraq, the consequences were far more grave. The result of the American intervention and then of the insurrection that followed contributed to the deaths of an estimated 200,000 Iraqis, perhaps as many as 8 million Iraqis were displaced, the majority of them displaced internally, but a couple of million Iraqis fled the country. So the consequences of that, of the war for Iraq, for the disintegration of Iraqi society, for the growing fratricide between Shia and Sunni Muslims inside Iraq. All of this was part of the consequence of 9/11 and the subsequent invasion of Iraq. One can also easily argue that the interventions in Afghanistan and then in Iraq diverted attention from the situation in Iran and gave Iran a greater opportunity to flex its influence and power inside the Persian Gulf and Middle East. It distracted America. The wars inside Afghanistan and Iraq distracted America's attention from the rise of China and the growing revanchism inside Putin's Russia, especially during the years after 2005, 2006. So the consequences of 9/11, of the intervention in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and the military invasion of Iraq have been tremendous. The ramifications resonate hugely to this very day.
Mhm. Yes, and like you, I certainly share the belief that American foreign policy, as in, amongst the other areas and facets of American political and social life, took a wrong turn after the September 11 attacks, with the the two wars that President Bush and his advisors prosecuted, both in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I believe he received great assistance from Prime Minister Tony Blair from the United Kingdom too. I think the consequences of those two wars caused the world to lose faith in the US and, of course, in the UK, and to a Western-led global order. And that's why we see the rise of, again, of, I guess, great power politics to, to put in the word, with Russia and China and everything.
Well, I mean, I agree, I think, with your generalizations. I would just interject that initially George Bush's initiatives had great support from the substantial majority of the American people. It was the failure of those actions that led to widespread disillusionment and demoralization. But the way President Bush initially handled 9/11, the immediate aftermath of 9/11, especially with regard to Afghanistan, whether we regard it as correct or incorrect, as competent or incompetent, 15 or 20 years later. At the time, Americans initially enthusiastically applauded George Bush's actions in the days and weeks after 9/11. In fact, his popularity ratings inside the United States reached almost 90%. His approval ratings, perhaps the highest of any American president in recent American history. So one does need to keep that in mind when one looks at this situation.
So, of course, this year, 2023, marks the 20th anniversary of technically the second invasion of Iraq, which we call the Iraq War. There's this misconception that goes around from people who are in the opposition. I suppose Michael Moore's movie Fahrenheit 9/11 is the great manifestation of that, in that President Bush didn't know what he was doing, and then he was misled into persecuting the war by, say, Dick Cheney and neoconservative advisors. So, from the research that you've done on this book, would you say that to be a correct assessment?
No, in fact, amongst the contributions of my research and my analysis are the following arguments, which very much conflict with the narrative you just presented, which is a narrative that's widely accepted. My book, in that sense, is somewhat revisionist, although, as you know from reading my book also emphasizes greatly the dysfunctionality and of the Bush administration and the tragedy that ensued from the dysfunctionality. But I also tried to show, one, that actually President Bush was very much in charge of the situation immediately after 9/11. I present quite a bit of evidence that substantiates that claim. Certainly, all of his advisors believed that he was totally in control. One of the important aspects of my book were the interviews that I conducted with most, not all, but most of the key decision makers. And I was surprised, since I started my book or the research on my book believing many of the assertions you just made, I was surprised to hear and then to read in the documents how almost unanimously Bush's advisors believed he was in total control of the situation. So as a generalization, I would say that the notion that Dick Cheney was controlling policy is wrong. The emphasis on the determining impact of the neoconservative advisors like Paul Wolfowitz and Douglas Feith, that their influence has been hugely exaggerated. Bush was the definitive decision maker. He was the decision maker. To say that, of course, is not to say that his decisions were wise. It's just to say that the notion that he was an inept, uninformed, peripheral person to decision making is absolutely wrong, categorically wrong. Bush was central to all the decision making, and he shaped all the key policies with regard to Iraq, many of which turned out quite poorly, but he was in charge.
So in President Truman's fashion, the buck did stop at President Bush.
Say that again, I'm sorry.
To quote President Truman, Harry Truman, the buck did stop at President Bush.
Yes, that's correct. But my research, also demonstrated, contrary to what is often asserted, that the major motivation behind Bush's policies toward Iraq was his preoccupation with preventing another attack. I argue forcefully that fear, worry, apprehension were driving forces behind Bush's policies. Fear alone does not explain what happened in Iraq. Fear alone does not explain the entirety of Bush's motivations. To understand what happened in Iraq, you also have to come to terms with the way Bush and his advisors thought about the utility of American power, and you also have to take cognizance of the hubris that they brought to the situation. But what I try to show in my book is that fear of another attack, guilt about the fact that 9/11 had occurred initially on their watch, a great sense of responsibility to thwart another attack. These were compelling concerns of the president himself and of the people around him. Bush was extraordinarily worried, for good reason, about the likelihood of another attack, perhaps inside the United States, an attack that might actually be worse than the one that had occurred on 9/11. There was reason for him to worry. He was bombarded with warnings that another attack was imminent. He was given information on a daily basis about the likelihood of multitude attacks occurring on any given day. I discuss in my book the development of what was called at the time the threat matrix. This was basically a list of prospective attacks that might occur each and every day in the days and weeks after 9/11. The intelligence community each and every day got together late in the afternoon. The top intelligence analysts and officials met each and every day to discuss, examine, and then itemize the the probable attacks that were likely to occur on subsequent days. Each and every day in the days and weeks after 9/11, the president was presented with this so-called threat matrix. Sometimes there were 30, 40, 50, 60 items listed in the intelligence briefing that the president received on any given day, and he would actually peruse them 1, 2, 3, 4 and begin to ask questions. Well, how serious is number 4? How serious is number 9? How serious is number 16, etc., etc. So there were widespread apprehensions that another attack would occur, because that's what the information was telling officials.
Mhm. So just to set the record straight further, to what extent did the neoconservative advisors, Paul Wolfowitz and Douglas Feith and I think Richard Pearl to play in the crafting of the prosecution of Iraq?
I mean, Paul, as a generalization, Paul Wolfowitz was the Deputy Secretary of Defense. Douglas Feith was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Richard Pearl sat on the President's Defense Intelligence Board, but he played virtually no role whatsoever. So the allusions to Pearl as a key decision maker are not borne out by any of the written evidence that I've seen, nor by the interviews. Wolfowitz and Feith were very much preoccupied with preventing another attack. They believed that Iraq might be the source of biological or chemical weapons that might be used by Al-Qaeda or any of the groups associated with Al-Qaeda or with other terrorist groups. They worried about Saddam's past development of biological and chemical weapons. They believed that he still possessed them, and they were intensely worried that Saddam Hussein might share those weapons with terrorist groups of one sort or another. Those were their beliefs, but in my book, I examine their beliefs and their actions very, very carefully, and I try to illuminate the extent to which they did or did not shape the president's behavior. So, for example, right after 9/11, Paul Wolfowitz was preoccupied with Iraq. He did think that perhaps it would be efficacious for the United States to take action against Iraq. But what I carefully show is that the president rejected this advice in the days and weeks after 9/11. President Bush put Iraq on a back burner because most of his advisors, including the vice president himself, Dick Cheney, did not think that Iraq should command the overriding American attention. So the president believed that the initial focus should be on Afghanistan. He did declare a so-called global war on terror, which meant that he would go after terrorists of a global reach, as well as the state sponsors of terrorism, of which he did consider Iraq one of the state sponsors. But his primary preoccupation in the days and weeks after 9/11 was to deal with Afghanistan. and he definitely, in that respect, rejected the advice of Paul Wolfowitz and of Doug Feith, the so-called neoconservatives. Let me say, since there's so much confusion about the role of neoconservatives and Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, that one has to keep in mind that that Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney were not neoconservatives. They were very traditional conservative American nationalists. Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney were not preoccupied with promoting democracy around the world, or and particularly not terribly preoccupied with promoting democracy in Iraq. Paul Wolfowitz and the neocons were concerned with the promotion of with their notions of promoting democracy and freedom, but these concerns were not those of were not those of Vice President Dick Cheney or of Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. And it is essential to keep in mind that Donald Rumsfeld ran the Defense Department, not Paul Wolfowitz, not Douglas Feith. And even though it's easy to illuminate, as many writers and journalists have done, that Paul Wolfowitz believed A, B, C, and D, it is much more difficult to demonstrate that Paul Wolfowitz had a determinative impact on Bush's policies toward Iraq. That he had some influence, yes, of course, but determinative, I would say not. And he was by no means as influential as Donald Rumsfeld or Dick Cheney.
So I want to spend a few moments talking about the man in your book's title, the other one, Saddam Hussein. And it is well known in American history that Saddam was an American ally, especially during the Iran-Iraq War. So how did this change? How did Saddam become an enemy to the United States?
Well, I would not say that that Saddam Hussein was an ally during the Iran-Iraq War. Certainly, Saddam Hussein did not think of himself as an ally of the United States, and he harbored deep suspicions of the United States. Those suspicions, from his perspective, were very much supported when there was the Iran-Contra scandal, which suggested that the United States was indirectly actually giving aid to Iran rather than to Iraq. So there was sharing of intelligence during the Iran-Iraq War with Saddam Hussein's regime, and there were definitely, the United States did not want Iran to prevail in that war, and so at various times the United States did balance, you might say, or tilt in favor of Iraq, but throughout these years, the United States harbored suspicions about Saddam Hussein for good reason, and Saddam Hussein harbored suspicions about the United States for good reason. Neither side, in other words, in my estimation, viewed themselves as quote unquote allies. They both saw the other as expedient partners that might be used opportunistically at one point or another. I'm glad you raised the subject of Saddam Hussein, because, as you know from looking at my book, that the first chapter of my book deals with Saddam Hussein, his rise to power, his ruthlessness, his brutality, his infatuation with weapons of mass destruction. At the same time, I also heavily emphasize that to understand Saddam Hussein in Iraq, one needs to grapple with the reality that Saddam Hussein played a critical role in the nationalization of the petroleum industry, in the use of oil revenues to dramatically increase the industrial and agricultural growth of Iraq. Saddam Hussein played a key role in using the oil revenues that mounted exponentially in the middle and late 1970s. Saddam Hussein used those revenues not only to develop his military capabilities and not only to begin development of his weapons of mass destruction arsenal, not only to begin development on a nuclear project, but also to hugely promote the health, education, and welfare of the Iraqi people. So there was this duality to Saddam, his brutality, his ruthlessness, his opportunism, his pragmatism, but also his desire to promote the greatness of Iraq and to improve the well-being of the Iraqi people, and ultimately for Iraq to become the dominant factor in the Persian Gulf and the Middle East, and to restore his own sense of Iraqi greatness and grandeur. So Saddam Hussein is a very complex person, and in my book, one needs to grapple with Saddam Hussein because I try to argue that he exerts important agency in the flow of events that ultimately lead to the invasion of Iraq. In briefs, though, just for listeners who want to be reminded of a critically important fact, Saddam Hussein became the enemy, you might say, of the United States. I would say he was never an ally, but he became the enemy of the United States in 1990 when he invaded Kuwait. And the United States and George W. Bush's father, President George H.W. Bush, put together a huge coalition to pressure Saddam Hussein to withdraw from Kuwait. And when he did not, the United States led the military intervention to drive Iraqi forces out of Kuwait back into Iraq and to restore the sovereignty and nationhood of Kuwait. That is when Saddam Hussein became an enemy. That is when the United States and Great Britain, but mostly the United States, pushed through a series of resolutions in the United Nations that required Iraq, in the aftermath of the First Persian Gulf War, that required Iraq to rid itself of its weapons of mass destruction, to release Kuwaiti prisoners, and to allow for the inspections of its own military arsenal. These were critical resolutions passed in 1990 and 1991, first calling upon Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait, and then calling upon Iraq to open itself up for inspections and to ensure that renewed aggression would not take place. That is when Saddam Hussein, 1990-91, became the so-called enemy of the United States.
So, of course, before 2003, America did confront Saddam Hussein, and the person who confronted him was incidentally George Bush's father, HW, and which makes me wonder, had it not been for 9/11, had 9/11 never happened, would would a second invasion of Iraq be warranted?
Would it be warranted? No. And so I think one has to make a distinction here between the desire of the United States for regime change inside Iraq and the desire for the United States and many other nations to ensure that Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction, and the invasion of and the subsequent invasion of Iraq. So the policy of the United States from the onset of the first Persian Gulf War in 1990-91 through the administration of 8 years of Bill Clinton's presidency, and then into the first 9 or 10 months of the George W. Bush administration, the policy of the United States was regime change. The policy of the United States was, in a sense, to confront Saddam Hussein. But it was not the policy of the United States to plan an invasion of Iraq. Regime change did not mean an invasion of Iraq. There were no real plans to invade Iraq prior to 9/11. Yes, there were war plans that, of course, always existed to deal with Iraq and to deal with many other nations. Yes, there were existing war plans, but there was no real plan for the invasion of Iraq prior to 9/11.
So I think there are two claims that would ultimately lead up to the invasion of Iraq that, in hindsight, were found to be tenuous at best. And you've alluded to the first one, that being that during the time frame of, say, from September the 11th to the invasion, Saddam Hussein was found to have harbored weapons of mass destruction. You have an image of Secretary of State Colin Powell holding a vial of what is purported to be anthrax at the UN General Assembly, and this is what he says that Saddam may have had held in his country, evading inspection and such. So, to what extent was that fact? Did Saddam Hussein harbor WMDs?
Well, I think to answer that question, one needs to go back to the 1980s and 1990s. So the basic facts are that, of course, that Saddam Hussein was interested in developing a nuclear bomb that was interfered with by Israeli military action. There's no question that Saddam Hussein, during the late 1980s and early 1990, once again was interested in accelerating that program of developing an atomic bomb. In fact, intelligence analysts have come to believe that he was far further along in developing an atomic project, an atomic bomb in 1991 than the information at the time actually even suggested. So that's, you asked me about what were the facts. That's one category of factual information. Another is that Saddam Hussein was extraordinarily interested in developing chemical and biological weapons throughout the 1980s. He used chemical weapons, of course, during the Iran war against Iran. He used chemical weapons against his own Kurdish dissidents toward the end of the Iran-Iraqi war. He ruthlessly murdered Shia opponents and foes during the aftermath of the Persian Gulf, the initial aftermath of the Persian Gulf Wars. These were the reasons why the United States was preoccupied, as many other nations were throughout the 1980s and then in the 1990s, with Saddam Hussein's development and employment of weapons of mass destruction, specifically his employment of chemical weapons. For the most part, we now know that in the mid and late 1990s, he abandoned his programs as a result of the inspections that were required of him. Initially, he cheated systematically, but as UN inspectors found more and more information, he grudgingly acknowledged, yes, he was cheating, yes, he had them, yes, he would destroy them. He throws out the inspectors for the most part in 1998 and does not allow them to come back to Iraq after 1998. As a result of that, there is much ambiguity about the degree to which he had actually complied and gotten rid of all his weapons of mass destruction. There's much ambiguity about whether he was continuing those programs, much ambiguity about whether he had gotten rid of those programs and now again was restarting them in the absence of inspections. So what I tried to show in my book, rather than just focusing on the well-known presentation of Colin Powell at the United Nations in early 2003, what I tried to do in my book is sort of month by month, week by week, month by month, to try to show what the intelligence community in the United States and elsewhere were saying about Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction. So to simplify, I would say that the evidence was suggesting after 9/11 that Saddam Hussein was restarting or continuing his chemical and biological programs. This was widely believed amongst American intelligence analysts throughout the United States government. I show very clearly by citing intelligence reports and intelligence summaries during the winter and spring and summer of 2002 that intelligence analysts believe that for the most part, Saddam Hussein had chemical and biological weapons, possessed them, or would be able to restart his programs very, very quickly if he wanted to do that. I demonstrate that this is not the neocons who were saying this. Of course, they were saying it, but this was more or less the established generalizations of American intelligence analysts and for the most part those of Great Britain and of many other nations, many other American allies. So there was a widespread belief that yes, Saddam Hussein had biological chemical weapons programs underway or could restart them very quickly. That was belief. It turned out to be wrong, but those beliefs I pretty well establish were widespread. Now, there was more controversy about Saddam Hussein's links to Al-Qaeda. For the most part, nobody, or virtually nobody, in the higher echelons of the American administration or elsewhere believed that Saddam Hussein was responsible in any way for 9/11. George W. Bush did not believe that, but he was worried that Saddam Hussein, because of his record of employment of chemical and biological weapons, because of his well-known hostility and antipathy to the United States, because of the fact that he actually applauded the developments of 9/11, President Bush, because of all those reasons, feared, suspected that Saddam Hussein might be capable of handing off his chemical biological weapons to some terrorist group or another. And I demonstrate, of course, that Saddam Hussein did, of course, have a widespread record of supporting suicide missions and various terrorist groups. These were not simply the results of American intelligence analysts, but actually captured Iraqi records now demonstrate that Saddam Hussein did have extensive ties to terrorist groups, did support suicide missions as normal activity. None of this, of course, suggests that Saddam Hussein had any role in 9/11, nor that he had an extensive relationship with Al-Qaeda. But President Bush was told that although Saddam Hussein did not have an extensive relationship, or maybe even no relationship with Osama bin Laden, nonetheless, there was a possibility that the Iraqis and Al-Qaeda or other Islamic fundamentalist groups might consort together in pursuit of a common objective, that is, inflicting pain on the United States.
Right. So I was going to address the Saddam Al-Qaeda connection, but since we've already covered that ground, so of course Saddam Hussein was executed in the year 2006. Would you say that Iraq now is better off without him?
Yes. I would say Iraq is better off without him. Anyone who reads the first chapter of my book will understand why I think Iraq is better off without him. And I think the vast majority of Iraqis would agree that Iraq is better off without him. He was a ruthless, brutal dictator. And although he was very successful in the 1970s in promoting economic growth and distributing the benefits of economic growth to the Iraqi people, his actions in the 1980s and the 1990s totally undermined the achievements that he had experienced in the 1970s. So by the end of the 1990s, what Saddam Hussein was a ruthless dictator who had totally undermined his own successful programs of economic development as a result of his adventurism against Iran and then against Kuwait, and as a result of his systematic cheating and defiance of UN resolutions. So Saddam Hussein in the late 1990s might have had a groundswell groundswell of support on the so-called Arab street in other nations, in Egypt, and of course in the occupied territories of Palestine. But inside Iraq, he was widely despised because he was a ruthless, brutal dictator who had murdered his own Kurds, his own Shia, and who systematically murdered anyone he suspected of opposing him inside his own government. So yes, I think Iraq is much better off without Saddam Hussein. A much more complicated question is whether Iraq is better off as a result of the American invasion or not. That is a much more complicated question. But if you ask me the question, is Iraq better off without Saddam Hussein? Yes, it would have been desirable, however, if one could get rid of Saddam Hussein without an invasion and a failed occupation.
Yes, and I would agree with that assessment. And I think the people of Iraqi Kurdistan would applaud that assessment, actually, because I've heard from a couple of people who I've studied with who are from Iraqi Kurdistan that the fact that Saddam is out is probably the best thing that's ever happened to them. So just on the side, what is Saddam Hussein's history with this population? Has he always had an antipathy towards them?
Towards the Kurds, you mean?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the relationship of the Kurdish people to the state of Iraq is to the nation of Iraq is a very complicated one, because at least a substantial number of Kurds, of course, who live not only in Iraq, but also in Iran and Syria, elsewhere, would like to have their own nation. And the Kurds of inside Iraq have long desired their own autonomy, and dealing with the Kurds was a tremendous challenge for any Iraqi leader, but a particularly difficult challenge for Saddam Hussein ever since he rose to power in the middle 1970s. So dealing with the so-called Kurdish problem was an ongoing one for Saddam Hussein, year after year, decade after decade. And his ruthlessness, of course, toward the Kurds at the end of the Iran-Iraq war were notorious, and he was widely despised by the Kurds. Of course, he engaged in equally ruthless activity, or you might say significantly repressive activity towards his own Shia in the south of Iraq at the end of the Persian Gulf War, which led many Shia, of course, to despise Saddam Hussein as well.
So going back to the U.S., the 2000 election between George W. Bush and Al Gore was quite close, and it took a Supreme Court decision to stop the recount in Florida for George Bush to be handed the victory. So I guess perhaps another exercise in counterfactual would be, suppose that the September 11 attack happened anyways. Would history change course had Al Gore been the president?
I don't know. This is a very complicated question. I think scholars would differ in their assessment. If you ask if you ask advisors to Al Gore, they often will tell you, no, it would not have happened if Al Gore were president. On the other hand, there is an extraordinarily interesting, extensive, and systematic study of this very counterfactual question by a political scientist named Frank Harvey, who wrote a very, very big book on this subject, which is a counterfactual history of what would have happened if Al Gore had been elected. And he comes to the conclusion that Al Gore would have invaded Iraq much as did George W. Bush. When I say much as did, I mean simply to be saying that Al Gore would have invaded Iraq. Whether he would have done it more effectively is not a question that is addressed in that book by Harvey. But to answer the basic question, would Al Gore have invaded Iraq? At least one very, very careful study of this question comes to the conclusion that he would have. But as I said, numerous advisors to Gore who I've spoken to deny that this would have been the case. On the other hand, you can see in the written record, and you can see in the speeches of Al Gore in 2000 and 2001 that he too regarded Saddam Hussein as a brutal tyrant who was adventurous and a challenge to the United States, a challenge that the United States really could not afford to live with. Now, whether that meant that he too would have invaded Iraq is another question, but that he regarded Saddam Hussein, as did Bill Clinton, as a huge challenge to American vital interests, as a terrorist supporter and brutal dictator. There was no difference between Al Gore, Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush. There may have been a different consequence. That's what we're discussing, whether or not there would have been. But they shared an antipathy. And keep in mind that Bill Clinton and Al Gore and Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State, all supported the policy of regime change before 9/11. That doesn't mean that they were about to invade Iraq, but would they have invaded Iraq after 9/11, given the uncertainties and insecurities and apprehensions? They too might have. I'm uncertain. I personally am uncertain about the answer to that. I think you can argue it either way, but there was a shared preoccupation with Saddam Hussein. Keep in mind the reasons for this after 9/11. Saddam Hussein's newspapers in Baghdad cheered 9/11. They supported 9/11. Keep in mind that in the days and weeks after American special forces first moved into Afghanistan in October of 2001, keep in mind that they immediately found incontrovertible evidence that the Taliban, that the Al-Qaeda in their camps inside Afghanistan, in their training camps inside Afghanistan, the Al-Qaeda terrorists were unquestionably seeking to acquire and develop chemical and biological weapons. There was no doubt about their aspirations. And at the same time, intelligence information was suggesting at that time, and I'm talking October, November, December 2001, that Saddam Hussein might indeed be restarting or accelerating his chemical and biological weapons. Subsequently, that turns out to be wrong, but the intelligence at the time suggested that that may well have been happening. And that is why attention gravitated to Iraq during October, November, December 2001. That is why President George W. Bush decided to ask his military leaders to develop a real war plan to deal with Iraq if Iraq did not open itself to weapons inspections. Keep in mind that during all these months after 9/11, Saddam Hussein refused to allow back the weapons inspectors. And so that fact accelerated the apprehensions and worries of American officials and intelligence analysts everywhere. If Saddam Hussein did not have weapons of mass destruction after 9/11, given the preoccupation with the consequences of 9/11, if he did not have those weapons, why not allow weapons inspectors back to confirm that he did not have have those weapons? That's what George W. Bush and Al Gore and most American leaders said again and again and again in the months after 9/11. If he does not have weapons of mass destruction, why not allow back the inspectors to confirm that? And I show in my book that Saddam Hussein has agency for what happens inside Iraq because he himself, for month after month after month, stubbornly opposed the return of inspectors. Now, he had his reasons, but whether those reasons were justified or not, the consequences for himself and for his country were grave. The consequences of his denying, at least for 9 or 10 months, the return of inspectors was tremendously important. Now, eventually, he does allow back the inspectors, and I assess what goes on in one of the latter chapters of my book. What are the consequences of his allowing back the inspectors?
Mm-hmm. So, final question. What are some of the lessons that I guess the U.S. governmental establishment, for lack of a better term, learn or fail to learn post 9/11?
Well, I've talked a lot about this, and I'm glad you asked that question. I think we could spend probably a whole nother podcast on what are the lessons, because they are very important lessons. Let me just quickly itemize a few of the lessons that should be learned by American policymakers. First of all, it's to be able to reassess basic assumptions. The basic assumption after 9/11 was that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. And there was good reason to hold that assumption. After all, Iraq had weapons, had used them, and had lied about them. But there are also reasons to doubt that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. The evidence was always, the ongoing evidence was always ambiguous. There was evidence, but it was fraught with ambiguities. People understood that, but they dismissed the ambiguities because of their prevailing assumptions. So one of the lessons is for policymakers is to re-examine basic assumptions. That is a very hard thing to do. I would say to you, as I often say to myself, how often do I re-examine basic assumptions? That is a very, very hard thing to do. Very few of us reassess basic assumptions, even when we're confronted with new evidence. So one of the lessons of this is for policymakers to step back and really reassess basic assumptions. Reassessment doesn't mean that you're going to reject those assumptions, but it does mean you should reassess them systematically and carefully. That was not done. A second lesson of this is that American policymakers need to grasp the limits of American power. I tried to demonstrate in this book that one of the important reasons for the invasion of Iraq was not just fear and apprehension, but it was also coupled with the basic assumption that the United States had enough power to overcome its fears, that the United States had enough power to deal with Saddam Hussein, that the United States had enough power to invade and occupy and reconstruct Iraq. And one of the things that the United States and policymakers need to learn is to come to terms with the limits of American power. Yes, the United States had the capability to defeat Saddam's armies, but its capabilities to occupy, stabilize, democratize, and develop Iraq were extremely limited. Part of it was the result of terrible planning and dysfunction, but be that as it may, the United States and policymakers have to have a really good grasp of the limits of American power. I also would say another lesson for Americans, for all Americans, but for American policymakers in particular, is to come to terms with their own hubris. What I show in my book is that hubris played a key role in the invasion, in the decision to invade Iraq. The belief was widespread that the United States had a superior economic political system, and that Iraqis would embrace American occupying forces, that Iraqis wanted to be free, that Iraqis wanted to be like Americans. And there was a lot of hubris that infused these beliefs of American policymakers, the belief that the United States had a superior system that everyone would embrace. These beliefs overlooked the fact that Kurds were deeply suspicious, Kurdish Iraqis were deeply suspicious of the United States because the United States had long betrayed Iraqi Kurds, over the decades. The Shia in the south of Iraq were deeply suspicious of the United States because they believed that George H.W. Bush, Bush's father, had encouraged them to rise up against Saddam Hussein in the aftermath of the First Persian Gulf War, and then did nothing to help the Shia when Saddam Hussein slaughtered them. So many Iraqis in the north and in the south were distrustful of the United States to begin with. American policymakers need to have a much better understanding of the peoples of other countries. I would also say there are many other lessons, but another important one I would emphasize is the importance of good staff work inside the American policymaking community. The memos that were written about the consequences of an invasion of Iraq were very, very poorly done. One of the famous memos written in the State Department, in the Near East Division of the State Department, was called The Perfect Storm. And it sort of outlined the consequences of an American invasion. And it was divided into three parts: all the things that could go wrong pre-invasion, all the things that could go wrong during the invasion, all the things that could go wrong after the invasion. Each part had about 15 or 20 or even 25 items of things that could go wrong, with no effort to assess the likelihood of any of these things happening. No effort to assess priorities about what would be the likely consequences. Good staff work is indispensable for good policy making, and I don't think the staff work in the policymaking community was extremely good. And then finally, I would say that the top policymakers should learn that they must clarify their priorities. And there was always, as I show in my book, always extreme tension and uncertainty in George W. Bush's own mind about what he was really trying to do in his Iraq policy. Was he trying to rid Iraq of Saddam Hussein? Was his overriding priority regime change? Or alternatively, was his overriding priority to make certain that Saddam Hussein did not have weapons of mass destruction? And the different actions were necessary depending upon what your priority really was. And in Bush's mind and in the minds of most of his policymakers, these two objectives sort of often collided with one another, and there was a lack of clarity of what the overriding objective of American policy should be, and therefore ambiguities about what types of actions should be taken in order to achieve the number one priority.
Yes, and I think I should really definitely invite you again on this program to talk about some of the ways in which U.S. foreign policy has failed, not just the U.S. and of the world. But on that wonderful note, thank you once again, Professor Melvyn Leffler, for being on this program.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to discuss such an important topic. Really appreciate it.